trying to earn support from its neighbors for the potential summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Chinese President Xi Jinping told a South Korean envoy that China supports U.S.-North Korea dialogue and that Beijing wants to boost relations with Seoul. Japan and South Korea, meanwhile, agreed that they will maintain maximum pressure on North Korea until it takes concrete actions toward denuclearization. And before I sit down with an expert to talk more about these meetings, let's first go over to Devin Whiting at the News Center for the latest headlines at this hour. Devin, take us away.
Hi, Jiun. South Korea's special envoys Tongyeong and Seo-hun are meeting with leaders in the region to consolidate support for the upcoming Inter-Korean summit and the planned talks between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. On Tuesday, Seo, the head of South Korea's intelligence agency, met in Tokyo with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who expressed support for talks with the North as long as they're aimed at getting the regime to give up its nuclear ambitions. Abe also said Japan is ready to provide support to make the summits a success. Meanwhile, Chung Eui-yong, who is South Korea's national security advisor, met in Beijing with Chinese President Xi Jinping. President Xi thanked President Moon for sending the delegation, saying it shows the importance of communication between the two countries. The Chinese leader is also throwing his support behind both of the summits. He said he hopes the inter-Korean talks will go well and produce achievements. Chung and Seo met with the respective foreign ministers of China and Japan as well. Chung is now on his way to Moscow, where he's due to hold talks with Russia's top diplomat Sergei Lavrov and, just maybe, President Vladimir Putin. As for those talks between the U.S. and North Korea, the Trump administration isn't backing off. The White House says it fully expects the potential historic talks to go ahead. All North Korea has to do is keep its promises, no weapons testing. But the U.S. Secretary of State has also revealed that so far Washington has had no direct contact with Pyongyang. Kwon Jang-ho has this report.
The White House brushed away any concerns on Monday over whether the unprecedented talks between the US and North Korean leaders will be able to take place, and said that preparations are underway. White House spokesperson Sarah Sanders explained that as long as Pyongyang keeps up its end of the bargain, the talks will go ahead.
Look, we fully expect that it will. The offer was made and we've accepted. North Korea made several promises, and if we hope that they stick to those promises, and if so, the meeting will go on as planned.
However, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who is currently on a diplomatic tour of African countries, revealed that so far there has been no direct contact with Pyongyang over the talks.
There will be several steps will be necessary to agree on a location, agree on the scope of those discussions. It's very early stages. We've not heard anything directly back from North Korea, although we expect to hear something directly from them.
Meanwhile, the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, briefed the United Nations Security Council on Washington's plans for the talks. He stressed that throughout this process, the international community needs to continue to maintain pressure on the North Korean regime.
We all agreed that we're optimistic about this opportunity, but we're determined. We're determined to keep up the campaign of maximum pressure until we see words matched with deeds and real progress toward denuclearization.
However, at a separate UN meeting on Monday, the UN Human Rights Council said that although the upcoming talks could be a historic occasion, they also urged all parties that North Korea's human rights record must be remembered and discussed with the regime.
My main message today is that any advancement on the security dialogue should be accompanied by a parallel expansion on the human rights dialogue.
Kwon Jang-ho, Arirang News.
Back here domestically, it's a critical week in the prosecution's investigation of former President Lee Myung-bak. The conservative ex-leader faces numerous charges related to corruption, and evidence is reportedly piling up. He's been summoned by prosecutors for questioning for the first time. That's going to start Wednesday morning. Lee Seung-jae reports.
With 5 months of intense investigations under their belt, the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office has subpoenaed former President Lee Myung-bak to appear at the office on Wednesday for interrogation as a suspect. The 76-year-old is facing nearly 20 charges, including violation of law on the management of presidential records and violations related to election law. Lee is suspected of receiving some 10.3 million US dollars in illegal funds from the state intelligence agency, individuals and businesses, including Korea's largest conglomerate, Samsung. Under the Act of Aggravated Punishment of Specific Crimes, anyone found guilty of receiving bribes in excess of $90,000 can face at least 10 years behind bars. The former president says he was not aware of any money transfers, and he has labeled the prosecution's probe as an act of political revenge by the Moon Jae-in administration. Investigators have also unearthed evidence that Lee is the real owner of DAS, a corruption-ridden car parts manufacturer, with the prosecution set to ask him about irregularities in the company's accounts, including slush funds totaling more than $28 million. Prosecutors believe a significant portion of these secret funds were used to finance Lee's presidential campaign in 2007. Prosecutors are also likely to grill Lee over presidential records, which were found in storage at DAS offices and not at the National Archives as required by law, and allegations he evaded tax by holding property and savings under borrowed names. With a long list of charges and allegations, the nation awaits the results of the questioning, which gets underway on Wednesday morning but could continue deep into the night. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
South Korea is hoping to get an exemption from the new U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum, but Washington still hasn't issued guidelines on how exactly an exemption can be obtained. President Trump signed off on his tariff proposals last week, saying countries can get a pass on the tariffs if they show ways to reduce the security threat posed by their U.S. exports. But that procedure is lacking detail. For now, temporary exemptions have been granted to Canada and Mexico, and Australia is also expected to get one, but other countries will see the tariffs take effect if they're not exempted by March 23rd. South Korea is working on it, sending its trade minister to Washington for the third time in less than a month. The Korean government plans to provide financial support to subcontractors and small businesses affected by GM Korea's shutdown of a local plant and those hit by restructuring in the shipbuilding industry. The companies getting support are in the southeastern city of Gunsan, where the GM plant is, and in Tongyeong, a major center for shipbuilding. In a meeting in Seoul on Tuesday, the Financial Services Commission said the government will set aside $122 million for its new guarantee program for subcontractors and work with local banks to postpone the repayment of existing loans taken out by small businesses and subcontractors there. An estimated 30,000 people have lost their jobs due to the slump in shipbuilding and the recent shutdown of the Gunsan plant. A plane carrying 71 passengers and crew has crashed on landing at Nepal's Kathmandu airport, reportedly killing nearly 50 people. The plane was arriving from the Bangladeshi capital of Dhaka, and there's confusion over who's to blame for the crash, air traffic controllers or the pilot. Noadam reports.
Flight BS-211 veered off the runway on a cloudy Monday afternoon as it came into land at the Nepalese capital's hill-ringed airport. There are conflicting accounts from the airliner and the airport on what happened. The CEO of US Bangla Airlines accuses Kathmandu's air traffic control for giving wrong signals. He added that the captain, who survived the crash, had more than 5,000 flying hours under his belt. He also insisted that after hearing air traffic control conversation, the pilot was not to blame. But the general manager of the airport says the pilot disregarded their messages and came in from the wrong direction. Airport officials had apparently told the pilot to approach the runway from the south, but he instead came in for landing from the north. When asked if things were okay, they said the pilot replied yes. Officials then told him that the plane was not properly aligned with the runway, to which there was no reply. Witnesses say the plane swerved repeatedly and was flying low before the accident happened. The charred remnants of the aircraft have been scattered across a grassy field near the runway, and rescuers are scouring the crash site. Just over a dozen people are said to have been pulled from the wreckage and are receiving treatment at a nearby hospital. The Nepalese Prime Minister, who visited the crash site, has promised an immediate investigation. The mountainous area of Nepal is notorious for poor air safety, and small planes often run into trouble at remote airstrips. Noadam, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines for this hour.
The head of South Korea's intelligence agency, as President Moon's special envoy to Japan, met with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on Tuesday and briefed him on the results of his recent visit to North Korea and the U.S. As our Blue House correspondent Hwang Ho-jun reports, the Japanese leader supports the move toward a dialogue.
According to the Blue House, the meeting was originally scheduled for 15 minutes, but lasted over an hour.
I came here today to deliver a message from President Moon Jae-in that cooperation between Japan and South Korea is essential to maintaining the progress towards peace on the Korean Peninsula that started with the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics.
In the meeting with South Korea's intel chief Seo Hoon, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe expressed his gratitude for President Moon Jae-in sending a special envoy to explain and detail the results of the recent talks in Pyongyang and the U.S. He said he respects President Moon's leadership for bringing about change and progress in inter-Korean relations and for taking steps toward the denuclearization of the peninsula. He also called those achievements the byproducts of close cooperation among Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo. There's been speculation that North Korea is simply trying to buy time, agreeing to two summits one after the other, but Abe told Seoul he doesn't believe that's the case. He welcomed the push for dialogue and promised Japan's support and cooperation for a successful summit between the two Koreas, as well as between Pyongyang and Washington. Prime Minister Abe stressed, though, that North Korea has to act on its promises.
It is extremely important that North Korea takes specific steps toward denuclearization, that these words become a reality.
Seo Hoon arrived in Japan on Monday and met first with Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono, who said Tokyo would work closely with Seoul and Washington and referred to the situation a near miracle. Seo is set to return back to Korea Tuesday night. As for President Moon's other special envoy, his top security advisor Chung Eui-yong, he has wrapped up his trip to China and is on his way to Russia on a similar mission. However, according to the Blue House, a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin seems unlikely since Russia is holding a presidential election this Sunday. Chung is scheduled to return back to Seoul on Thursday. Hwang Ho-jun, Arirang News.
And to tell us more about South Korea's recent efforts to step up cooperation with its neighboring states to help pave the way for a possible summit between the U.S. and North Korea, Professor Kim Hyunwook from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy joins us in the studio today. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
All right, so South Korea's special envoys headed to China and Japan to brief the leaders of those countries about their meetings with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Now, at this point, we want to know what kind of roadmap does the South Korean government have in regards to the denuclearization efforts here on the Korean Peninsula, and also what's the big picture here involving its neighboring states?
I think the South Korean government's delegates are visiting countries of the previous six-party process. But I'm not sure if the roadmap and the big picture you mentioned is whether South Korea is intending to organize a six-party talk again. I'm not sure if that's possible, but I think at least South Korea is now trying to bring countries into this kinds of dialogue mood and their cooperation. Now the China and Japan and other countries are pretty much excluded from the current phase. It's pretty much that South Korea, North Korea, and the U.S. are the only active partners in this mood. So maybe one important purpose would be to bring them into this phase, maybe persuading them for a more active cooperation in this phase for the denuclearization of North Korea. But I'm not sure if still the South Korean intention is to bring those countries form a six-party process again, because that's not the format that the Trump government wants.
Now, President Moon's top security advisor, Tongyeong, actually headed over to China, like we heard, to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Now, I think it's interesting that right now, China's two sessions, which are annual meetings of the national legislature and the top political advisory body, is ongoing right now in China. And I think it's unusual for President Xi to actually take his time out to meet with Zhang during this period.
Yes, you're right that now that China has such a big two parliamentary meetings going on, and when there are important domestic events, Chinese officials do not have much time allotted for the foreign events and meetings. I think this time, I think this clarifies that Xi Jinping thinks this meeting very important. For the time being, the Chinese leader was not actively involved and intervened in the denuclearization process. U.S. Trump government has been pressuring hard on China, focusing on the role of China in dealing with North Korea. And also recently, the U.S. is dividing its policy towards North Korea and China. Before, North Korea was used as an important tool for the states to pressure China, and now U.S. is dividing these two. Regardless of the role of China on North Korea, U.S. is now about to begin a trade war with China. So the position of China now is very much, shrink. I mean, it wants to do something, but because of the U.S., active pressure on China, its relationship with the United States is not good. Its influence on the Korean Peninsula is very much diminished. So maybe President Xi Jinping wants to revert its influence in the Korean Peninsula. And the meeting itself that Tongyeong visited China and briefed the current issues to Xi Jinping, I think this is a very important time and opportunity for China to revert its influence on the Korean Peninsula and also revert the relationship with South Korea altogether.
Showing that it actually cares about what's going on.
Sure.
All right. Well, what kind of message do you think Mr. Jung then handed over to Mr. Xi?
Maybe the message would have been that China passing is not the one going on. China's role is still very important in denuclearizing North Korea. I think South Korea is kind of worrying about the North Korean diplomacy. Before, even during the six-party process, after the first nuclear test in 2006. China was very harsh on North Korea, and North Korea went into the side of the United States. They had a secret deal and came up with, February 13th agreement in 2006. So I think China is worrying about this. Now North Korea is on the side of the United States, but South Korean government is worrying if the U.S. and North Korea deal is not going well, North Korea would go back to China again. No process in denuclearization because of North Korea's diplomacy between the U.S. and China. So I think we need to have a very solid cooperation with China so that we can prevent this kinds of diplomatic maneuvers of North Korea. So I think there's still, all in all, when you look at what happened before, the role of China is very important to firmly make North Korea go into the pathway of denuclearization.
And Mr. Xi also said that he would like to see South Korea and China boost their communication and also properly resolve some sensitive issues. So what are some of the things that China is likely to focus in regards to Seoul and Beijing relations from here on out?
This, I think, is very clear and important, critical, comment and juncture that finally, China and South Korean relationship is reverting back to normal because of that deployment issues. China, because for China, South Korea is a very important state and country for its strategic, interest. But because of China's, which we call the face, and also, what Xi Jinping mentioned about these THAAD issues. South Korea, you should not do that, all that kind of things, but things went against what Xi Jinping said. So maybe China wanted to revert its relationship with South Korea, but reluctantly doing that. So I think there came out this kind of important critical event, which made Xi Jinping said very bluntly that now is time for us to, revert our relationship back normal. So I think this is a very important, opportunity window for China.
All right. Now, shifting our focus a little bit, the director of South Korea's National Intelligence Service, Ha-hoon, visited Japan to brief Tokyo on his visit to North Korea. Now, Seo met with Japanese Foreign Minister Kono Taro on Monday, and they agreed to maintain maximum pressure on North Korea. So let's first listen to what the Japanese Foreign Minister had to say.
Japan and South Korea agreed we will continue to apply maximum pressure on North Korea until it results in concrete action.
All right, so Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was also able to meet with Seo-hoon on Tuesday, and he expressed his support for talks with North Korea, but did emphasize that North Korea need to give up its nuclear weapons. So at this point, we're wondering, where does Japan stand on its stance toward multilateral cooperation on denuclearization efforts?
I think Japan's position's changing a little bit. I mean, before Japan needed a very concrete sanction measures vis-a-vis North Korea in the same front line with the United States and South Korea, which is important, policy for Shinzo Abe's domestic popularity. It needed to make North Korea as an important threat target, and using them, it wants to, Shinzo Abe wants to normalize Japan, revise its constitutions. But now things are changing, and now it's a diplomatic phase, it's dialogue phase, which is no good for Shinzo Abe. But still, this doesn't mean that it would just maintain its hardline policy towards North Korea. Things are changing very abruptly. The U.S. is, gearing towards, approaching towards the dialogue phase. So I think what Japan is worrying about is that whether Japan will be isolated from all these, dialogue phase.
Right.
So it wants to jump into this dialogue mode. I mean, whether it's a multilateral dialogue, Japan would have an important role in denuclearization of North Korea. So I think that's what Shinzo Abe and Foreign Minister Gono's statement, that it would have a concrete cooperation with South Korea about denuclearization of North Korea, which means that it would, whether it's dialogue or sanctions, it would do something together with South Korea and the United States.
And what's also interesting is that Japan is willing to provide money for International Atomic Energy Agency inspections if needed. Now, what can we make of this?
Yeah, this is a clear sign that Japan is really worrying about being passed by international community's dialogue phase with North Korea. And also Japan also knows that important turning point for denuclearizing North Korea is verification. Trump government wants a dismantlement of North Korean nuclear weapons. But in order to go to that end point, there should be many stages and many steps. But still, if we have to choose one important step, that should be verification. I mean, if we say, okay, North Korea would say that, okay, we froze our program.
Right.
We capped our program, but we don't know that. In order to know that, there should be, a verification team to be going into North Korea, check that out, check out all the facilities and see what North Korea said is true or not. So verification is a very important concrete step that would make a dismantlement process, boost up, so that it will go into the end point. So I think Japan knows that, and Japan wants to have an important role in that kinds of concrete and important process.
All right, and last but not least, Russia is next on the list, as National Security Advisor Tongyeong is traveling to Russia. And although we're not sure that if he's going to be able to be meeting Russian President Vladimir Putin, what can we expect from there?
I think Russian position is very, unclear. Russia wants to expand its sphere into the Korean Peninsula, maybe vis-a-vis the U.S. and also vis-a-vis China.
Right.
But also at the same time have some cooperation with China against the U.S. coming back into the Asian region. So maybe Russia would welcome if Tongyeong goes to visit Russia and briefs about current events. Russia would welcome its willingness to take a very active role in denuclearizing North Korea. But one thing that for me to make Russia's role very passive is that Russia does not have any negative impact from the North Korean issues. If North Korea shoots any missiles, Japan would be panicked. If North Korea tests nuclear weapons, China is worrying about it because any nuclear materials would be endangering the people in China. If something happens, some kind of contingency happens in North Korea, there should be a lot of refugees going over to China, which is a very important panic to China. But Russia does not have any kinds of these threats. So no threats, no urgency. Maybe, getting there would give them some benefits, but unless there are, no enough threats for Russia, I don't think Russia would be hurrying and jumping in with urgent, interests as Japan and China have.
They're in quite a different position compared to China and Japan. All right. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you very much.
And that does it for today. We'll be back here tomorrow at the same time for more news updates, so don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and see you soon.